Hello, readers. It's time to talk about our next lesson, describing in depth a character in a story or drama. We're going to use some of the implied details today in the text to help us talk about characters in the story. Reminding you of the story elements that are required for literary text. This makes it different than informational text, and today's focus is on characters. But today we're going to focus on how characters change. The characters you read about in stories change just like you. And while we don't always change in a quick second, we sometimes change over time. You'll notice that our characters change throughout the story. All characters don't change, but the ones that show their change are usually important to the theme of the story. When we look at a character and we look at how they may change their feelings on a topic, their looks, or their age, or they may change their opinions. They also learn new things as they solve problems, and that's when we see that clue for the theme that we'll be talking about. Today, we're going to continue our focus on the story Stray by Cynthia Rylant from the book Every Living Thing. We'll focus on the character of Mr. Amos Lacey today. Now, Mr. Lacey is the character that plays the role of Doris's father. And we're going to go through and understand how he changes throughout the story. I think you can agree with me when I say Doris doesn't really change. She sees the dog, she wants the dog, and she keeps her feelings throughout. So the story's end result of her receiving the dog is mostly because of the change in Mr. Lacey's character. Let's look at that for a moment. So here I have a graphic organizer where I've taken some notes that I thought were important when I would describe how Mr. Lacey has changed. We see at the beginning of the story, he's cleaning his fingernails with a pocket knife at the table when Doris brings the dog in. He says, "I don't know where it came from," he said mildly, "but I know for sure where it's going." So he had his mind made up before Doris ever said anything. That's the implied meaning, that he already had a strong point of view and Doris has to change his thinking. He does agree to let the dog stay because the weather's too bad to take it to the pound. So all of that happens in the first couple of pages of the story. It's unclear. We have to really do some inferencing to figure out what is the event that caused the character to change. There's no one point where we can say, yes, he changed his mind. And Cynthia Rylant kept it as a surprise for you to keep the story exciting. So when we look at this, we know two things happened. We know that right before Mr. Lacey left the house, Doris whispers please to him when he's loading the dog in the trunk. Now, it doesn't tell me anywhere in the story about Mr. Lacey's feelings for Doris, but I can infer that he loved his daughter and that he wants her to be happy. Next, at the end of the story, he talks about the conditions of the pound, that it had bad conditions. There were 10 dogs to a cage. They give them 6 days to live, and then they give them a shot that kills the dog. So we can infer that there was a bad experience once Mr. Lacey got to the pound. We don't know for sure. We're just hearing what he says. And that all leads us to how he is at the end of the story, where he's sipping his coffee and he's explaining his experience at the pound. And his final line in the text is, "Are you going to feed it or not?" And a lot of times, authors give the last word to an important character that leads to the change in the story. So as a reader, I'm always looking for who's the last one to speak, because if you gave them the last word, he must have an important role in the story. So I took that information and then I turned it into my description of Mr. Lacey. Mr. Amos Lacey seems tough and strong at the start of the story. He cleans his fingernails with a pocket knife and seems demanding when he says the dog can't stay with the family. During the story, Mr. Lacey watches Doris as she cares for the dog, but loads the dog into his car to take it to the pound when the weather clears. Before he leaves to go to the pound, Doris whispers, "Please." He doesn't respond. Later, we find out that Mr. Lacey returned home with the dog. He said the pound was no place to leave the dog and he had to bring it home. This change allows Doris to have what she wanted. And so now that we've described Mr. Lacey, we know how important his role is in this text. Today, as you're reading, make sure you look for those characters that really have an impact on the outcome of the story. Who had the last word? What changes did they go throughout the story? Happy reading!